Okay, good morning. I am going to do a quick discussion with you about what's known as the endosymbiotic theory. And today's discussion is going to ask a fundamental question, and that is, how did cells become complex? And in order to understand this question, you need to know the basic difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. It is for this reason that we've spent the last few days reviewing this concept and reviewing the complexity of eukaryotic cells. This is going to be our kickoff into our first discussion about evolution. So starting next week, we are going to learn about the theory of natural selection, and we're going to use this as a model of an evolutionary process that has occurred. I'm going to try to keep this talk down to about 5 to 7 minutes because there are other activities I'm going to ask you to do to investigate endosymbiosis. So I don't want to spend a huge amount of time here. I'm going to do a tiny bit of review, and then I'm going to set the stage for the work that you guys are going to do today. So let's begin. You are looking right now at the inside of a complex eukaryotic cell. You can see a motor protein. The motor protein is this thing carrying a vesicle from one area of the cell to another. And this shows us how complex eukaryotic cells are. Now, just a reminder to you, something we learned about at the first unit, I think, of this course, and that is that there are 3 categories of life. That we believe all life began with a simple cell. Maybe it was some kind of circular or coccus prokaryotic organism. And when we look at the world, we can define them into one of 3 domains. And those 3 domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. These 2 are prokaryotes, and the last is a eukaryote. And the endosymbiotic theory predicts that somewhere around here, some ancient prokaryote gave rise to eukaryotes. And the question we want to ask is, how did this happen? Now, what we do know is that simplicity gives rise to complexity. The computer was not invented in a day. The computer is based on microchips, which is based on wires, which is based on circuits, and so on. So many simple things were added to get to a computer. And the endosymbiotic theory that explains the evolution of eukaryotes is contingent on that idea that simplicity, simpler cells, gave rise to complex cells. So I want to begin by just looking at the raw advantage of being a prokaryote versus a eukaryote. Now, prokaryotes, we know, are small, which means they have less energy requirements. They're also simple, which means they need less genetic code. Furthermore, simple things have fewer things that can go wrong. So this simplicity can actually be an advantage. Another advantage is that prokaryotes reproduce fast. So what that means is they can occupy a resource like a chunk of food faster than other things because they can divide and divide and divide and divide and devour that food source. So there are some real advantages to being prokaryotic. On the other hand, eukaryotes are complex, which means that they can have a complex metabolism. They are large, which means that they can eat small things. And they have a system of sex, which allows for genetic diversity. And this allows for faster, complex evolution. The other thing that eukaryotes exhibit is division of labor. In a prokaryote, the cell must eat and get energy and reproduce, and it's got one vessel, one thing that has to do it all. With that simple genetic code in its interior. Whereas a eukaryote has a way more complex cell structure with a library of genetic information stored in a nucleus and different organelles that can make energy and organelles that can store stuff like resources for later, and so on. So that division of labor can be a huge advantage. So we are left with this question: how did cells become complex? And the answer to that question, we think, lies in a concept that we see in nature. And that concept is symbiosis, which means living together. And we see all sorts of models of symbiosis in the world. Some of those symbiotic models are outside the organism. So here we have a gray whale that lives symbiotically with barnacles. And this symbiosis is these things living together. Here we have a moray eel with a cleaner shrimp. The cleaner shrimp eats parasites, cleans the teeth of the eel, while the shrimp gets a meal. It gets food in exchange for that. They live together, they benefit. We would call this a mutualism. Some types of symbiosis are parasites. In this case here, we are looking at a maggot growing inside of a human, eating the human's resources, and eventually going to be a fly. So we have different types of symbiosis. We have some where both benefit. So we would say that this is a plus-plus relationship. The eel gets its teeth cleaned, the shrimp gets free food. We would call this one a plus-minus relationship. Plus for the maggot who gets to eat the resources that the human has created. And these plus minuses we call parasites. Well, we actually think that complex cells evolved as a result of an interesting type of symbiosis called endosymbiosis, which is one organism living inside of another. And we have models of this on the planet today. For example, this is a lichen, and lichen are a symbiotic relationship of fungi plus algae. Algae do photosynthesis. Which means they make sugar. But algae are typically stuck in water. They have to stay in a pond, in a lake, in a stream. Fungus absorb nutrients, but they get to live outside of water. So here we have a case where the algae is living inside of the fungus. It gets protection from drying out. It gets to occupy a new space, a new habitat, can compete away from all the other algae in the world. And the fungus gets free food because it eats the sugar that the algae is making. This is a mutualism. A similar type of mutualism occurs with coral. These are corals. Now, coral are animals. They look like flowers, but they are animals. And these coral have algae living in their tissues. And it's the algae that makes them colorful. It's what makes coral look so pretty. But much like the fungus, what's happening is the coral actually eats its algae buddies, and the algae get the protection from the coral so that other things can't eat it, because coral have little stingers on it. And when a fish wants to eat the coral, it gets stung, and so the algae gets protected. Again, what we are looking at here is something called a mutualism. The mutualism is occurring because one organism is living inside the other. So what does the endosymbiotic theory predict? It says, if Luca was a prokaryote, this is the question we're asking, how did eukaryotes evolve? We know that symbiosis means living together. If there was an advantage to living together, where both organisms benefit, then evolution would select for that. It would reinforce that. So the question we want to know, or the question that the endosymbiotic theory attempts to answer, is did different types of prokaryotes begin living together? So I'd like to share with you a living model. This is a eukaryotic organism. It is related to an amoeba. It's called mixotric. It has no mitochondria. And it has no cilia, which are the little things that help it move. And so you might be looking at this and saying, well, what the heck? If it has no cilia, what are these things? And what mixotric does is it collects bacteria, sticks it on its membrane and sends it signals so that the bacteria will move the mixotrick around. Two organisms living together. Where are their mitochondria? Well, it turns out that mixotrick eats a type of bacteria that makes energy, but it doesn't digest it. Instead, they live together, and mixotrick protects the bacteria, and that bacteria in here gives mixotrick energy. They have a plus-plus relationship. The endosymbiotic theory predicts that complex cells arrived or evolved as a result of a host consuming another prokaryote, but not digesting it, and that they live together symbiotically in a plus-plus relationship. The rest of today's activity explores the details of this. I hope you found it interesting, and have a great day.